Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, welcome back. It's another episode of the Koala podcast, and I'm speaking to somebody I haven't spoken to for a while, Daniel Shortt. He was at Greenlight and then subsequently with his new law firm partner, Perry Salzhauer, at Mcglinchey. They have now left Mcglinchey and are starting up their own firm. Daniel is licensed out of Washington and Perry is licensed out of Oregon and New York. So we're just going to discuss not so much why they left Mcglinchey, but what the new firm is doing, what they're seeing arise in business, and what they hope to achieve with the firm. And it's great to see people coming out and starting new independent and, should I say, younger firms as well, which is I was waiting for this to happen. Hopefully more of it's going to be happening over the next 24 months as the next generation of cannabis lawyers comes to play. And as we'll discover, it's not just cannabis. And I think that's what's interesting. They're sort of full firm practices that understand the entire sort of network of what's happened over the last decade. Okay, sorry, Daniel, a bit of a long intro, but just thought I'd try and throw all that in. Congratulations on the new firm.
Thank you.
I suppose I should ask you, why did you decide to start a new firm? Did it just give you, simply, is it just give you a bit more freedom?
Well, I mean, I think that, freedom is part of it. I was actually, raised, my dad's a small business owner. I remember him starting his business, out of my parents' bedroom. It's been running now for almost 25 years. So the idea of, opening up my own shop with my partner, Perry, but the idea of kind of having the autonomy has always been appealing to me. But a big part of it is that I think that when it comes to advising business clients, there's a huge kind of gap in, who can hire a lawyer. And what you find is that you may have a small sole proprietor or a partnership where you can get by with, limited documents. Maybe you use LegalZoom, maybe you go to AI. Maybe that's okay. I mean, often it's not, but,
Yeah.
And then you have, large corporations that can hire bigger firms and have their own in-house counsel. But frankly, a large portion of businesses fall somewhere in between those two areas. And in the cannabis industry, especially, and I'm talking about hemp and I'm talking about marijuana, a lot of the businesses are these kind of mid-sized to smaller companies. And what I'd really like to accomplish with this firm is to be able to, provide services at a very high level that are affordable and, allow these businesses that have these complex needs, because once you take in these regulated substances and add it to part of the mix, you certainly cannot use LegalZoom. I mean, the number of issues that we see with these, forms, especially in these heavily regulated industries, you may be saving a little bit of money up front.
They're clueless. None of these companies understand these industries, and their clients are far more sophisticated than the people providing the software and the forms. They've been in it, some of them, for 25 years.
Absolutely.
Just because they don't have quadrillion dollars. I mean, that's, and that's why I find interesting, because, essentially you guys are based out of the Pacific Northwest, which has businesses that want to make money, but they don't want to run the entire world. They, I mean, my experience of living in Oregon for a while is, looking at the wine industry, and it's a perfect example of these sort of very sophisticated businesses. But at some point, they don't want to grow. They just want to provide a better service or a better product far more efficiently. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, there's so many needs that a business has for legal services. But what you find sometimes is that businesses, they're a business owner, and I can actually relate to this more myself now since I've gone off and formed this new firm. There's a million things going on. And I think what happens sometimes is that you can compartmentalize, and then you don't deal with legal issues as they arise, or you don't realize that they're coming. And that's really one of the main roles that I have, because when I get a client, sometimes you bring in a client and they have one specific need, you handle it for them, and you each go on your way, and that's it. But I try to form lasting relationships with clients where they're coming to me when they have an idea, rather than after they've done something and maybe done it in a way that doesn't set them up for success. I don't want to just come in and say, here's what needs to be done. Did you do this? Did you do that? I like to let that happen more organically, so that you can come in and figure out what's needed, figure out the client's risk tolerance, their budget, and be able to work with them to, build a better product, service their existing customers, or if they do want to grow, do so in a way that is going to be sustainable and sound from a legal perspective.
What sort of issues now in a quite mature Pacific Northwest market are, let's start with cannabis stroke marijuana firms. Are you finding that there's I'm hoping there is, I don't know, a new upswell of new younger businesses trying to develop a space within this sort of quite mature market, but at the same time with lots of opportunity? And how are they, if they're younger, they understand technology, probably less so than law, and how are they understanding how to work all those things together so they can build a successful and sustainable business?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, you're always going to see buyers and sellers entering or exiting the market. So that still happens, right?
Yeah.
And we are a mature market, but it's not a secret to anyone that the price of cannabis has been dropping, and so it's just as challenging as it has always been. With respect to the question about sort of younger generations of leadership, what I've noticed lately, and what I really like to see, and it's something I always advise clients, is that normally when you get hired by a business, you're going to, especially businesses kind of in this sector, you're going to mainly be working with either the owner or one of the owners. What I've seen more and more is the managers on the call. They're bringing in their HR people. They're bringing in more folks who are part of the team, so that they can work with the legal counsel directly. Because I'll tell you one way, and I really try to drive this home to clients, we bill by the hour, right? That's how lawyers bill. I mean, there are some flat fees, there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, you are paying for our time. Now, if you're paying for our time, don't you want it to go as far as possible, right? So if we're working on something, say we're developing a licensing, like a branding strategy, well, it makes sense. And you have somebody who's overseeing multiple stores. It makes sense to have that person in on the discussion. And so that's what I've seen more and more clients do, is kind of bring in the younger talent, or the newer talent, to really work with me directly, so that it's not a
So
string
they understand
of
what
emails
law
getting
is, because I mean
forwarded.
they essentially understand what everything else is, but law is still a bit of a mystery to everybody, isn't it?
That's why we have lawyers.
That is what we
That's
have
why
lawyers.
we safeguard that. So we can all
Well,
keep our jobs.
yeah. Well, we'll see. Everybody's obsessed by AI taking that, but I think that's a long way before that happens. In the quick preamble, you say you're not just dealing with cannabis, you're dealing more with in the hemp side a bit, but also, because you're in the Pacific Northwest, more psychedelics. What's actually happening in terms of the type of work you can do? Because there's nothing really operating in Washington, and it's still a pretty
Correct.
small program in Oregon, isn't it?
Correct. Yes. And while I did a significant amount of work in Oregon kind of in the early days, that really hasn't been a driving force lately. What we're seeing is, working with some healthcare professionals, right? So doctors, therapists, psychiatrists, who are often just trying to get a lay of the land, trying to understand, the University of Washington has a psilocybin program, trying to understand that, trying to understand what they can and can't do, right? Lawyers, we can't assist in the commission of a crime, right? So if there's some underground journeys going on, things like that, we can't, set that up, or we're really limited. But what we can do is we can kind of explain, here's what decriminalization means. Here's, what your code of ethics has to say about this. Here are some studies that are going on. And I think one of the most valuable things we can do for that specific section is talking about the what's coming up, right? Where can we go? How can you position yourself to develop this skill set? We actually have, so Perry and I are the partners, but we have my longtime colleague John Rapp. He's in an of counsel role with us.
Yeah.
And I've been working with John for years. And I am really glad that I can continue to do so. He actually works a lot with RFRA, the Religious Freedom Reformation Act. And so he's involved with some psychedelic churches. So that's another area where we're seeing work.
I was talking to Taylor Lloyden last week on the show, and she said that that for the religious freedom aspect of trying to define things under constitutional law is actually quite a sort of big topic at the moment.
No, it absolutely is. And what I like about that too is you'll see groups that you may not necessarily think would align on this, but the Church of Latter-day Saints, right? There's all these Catholics. I was raised Catholic, right? And we have the sacrament of the bread and the wine, and there's a reason why at a Catholic church, when you get into second grade, you can start taking a sip of wine. So you do have that religious freedom protection,
psychedelic transubstantiation. Yeah.
yeah. Why not?
That's that sounds like a brand to me.
Right. I think the altar boy in me is having a hard time making jokes.
Okay.
I'm worried that a nun's going to come out and hit me on my knuckles. But I think it to me, it's a really fascinating area of the law. And, kind of going back to the bigger point as to why I wanted to venture out and do this, and why I think, I'm uniquely suited to help businesses in all of these regulated industries, is I find it incredibly fascinating. I was drawn to cannabis in law school because I was just very interested in the dormant commerce clause, which is, a lot of people hear that and their eyes glaze over, especially if they're not lawyers. But, I'm just fascinated by the way that this all has worked with these various substances that are, prohibited on one level, but are allowed at the state level or the local level. And it's infinitely fascinating to me. And I think that's what really drives the work. If I'm ever working with, young law students, because I teach a course at the University of Washington, I always tell them, find something that actually interests you, right? Don't just try to follow the money.
And if conveyancing interests you, well, good luck. But, you don't have to do it.
Right. But people are interested by all kinds of things. But, if you can find something because that's going to drive you more than anything else, right? You can sort of white knuckle it and get through and, do it that way. But if you have that spark of interest, it's really going to carry you a long way. And I think that resonates with clients and other attorneys that I've worked with. So yeah, I think, and again, back to the psychedelics, the religious freedom aspect of it is very, very fascinating to me.
You also mentioned in the preamble that when you start a new firm, you're obviously going to be looking for clients everywhere, and as you just said, in the sort of in the compound stroke sin area, which is where we're sort of there, where the outside perception still thinks about these things. You said there's a rise in sort of nicotine and tobacco work. I'm really interested in what that means in the environment that we live in today, where essentially, I know the US is a bit different from most other jurisdictions because there are actually the equivalent of craft nicotine or tobacco companies. You wouldn't find that in Australia. But the reason I'm interested actually is Australia is a really good example. Is they went crazy on tax and health in Australia price cigarettes completely ridiculously. So a packet of cigarettes costs $50, sometimes $60. And now
Wow.
you've got a huge black market with people burning down shops, killing each other, and all this sort of stuff. It'd be really interesting to know what sort of market you're working in and what the discussion is.
Yeah, so specifically what I'm talking about here mainly are, nicotine products that don't contain or aren't derived directly from tobacco. So we're
Okay.
talking about vapor products. There's the Zyn pouches or other pouches that are really popular. And, the way it's interesting because different states take different approach to this. But what I find interesting and where I think, the value add is for the client is that these products have developed faster than the regulations, right? So a classic example, is the way that certain the way that the sort of language has changed to try and catch up with these products
So
because
is this in the same way? It's the same as hemp for human consumption.
yeah.
It's a very similar market. It's science is quicker than the legislators and the regulators.
I think that that's a good example. Now it's not quite the same because the FDA and sort of some of the other regulators, the post office specifically, with because they regulate the distribution of cigarettes in the mail through the PACT Act. But they've been more ahead of it than they were with hemp. But really, you have these products that aren't tobacco, right? Because they don't have tobacco in it, but they have nicotine. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about it is that nicotine itself, it's not necessarily completely safe. It's incredibly addictive, but it's not the same. It's not necessarily accurate to just lump nicotine in with tobacco, right? That if you look at the studies on sort of lung cancer, all these things, they're just different. Again, I'm not saying that vaping is totally safe. There's all kinds of issues that can come up, especially if you're using products that are not sort of regulated.
But the simple fact is, science is going to develop stuff. And somehow it has to be managed and understood, yeah?
Well, absolutely. And what you're seeing is similarities in terms of, the way that states are regulating these. Obviously, you need a license to sell these, tobacco license or nicotine license. There's, record requirements. You need to make sure that these products are child-proof, and you need documentation of that. You have, and what's interesting too, and what we've seen is that these agencies are developing their policies and they're taking these regulations on nicotine products and they're starting to enforce them. And what I've found is that actually can create a really helpful environment where, and I'm a private lawyer who works in regulated spaces. So you would think that, my biggest enemy is regulators, but I don't look at it that way. I try to work with the regulators. So if someone comes in and you kind of have this understanding that, hey, look, we're all figuring this out. Let's find a solution. If there's been a violation, or if you think there may be a violation, let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. And most of the time when I've gone through those scenarios, it's the violation has been dismissed or the issue has been remedied.
This is an interesting point because you came out of law school. You've been mainly working in cannabis law. And
Correct.
In the early days, older lawyers or lawyers from another generation think, well, what's cannabis law? What's the point of that? But in this discussion, what you're telling me is that the lessons that were learned through early days of cannabis law and working with fuzzy legislation and regulators have provided you with the skill set to do that across the board with compounds and products as they develop over the next 40 years, because every day now science can invent new drugs, either for pleasure or for health, and AI is just going to increase that. So do you see that as part of how your firm is going to grow?
I like to think so, and I hope so. I feel like because I started, I am a true blue cannabis attorney, right? I have worked in the cannabis industry before I even had a license. I was working with Harris Slawski and, writing. And I think one thing that is helpful to me is that I am comfortable with uncertainty. I will make sure that I know everything that I can know about an issue. But I also understand that there are things that just aren't determined or can't be known at this time. And I'm comfortable with that. And I'm very comfortable saying, when I don't know something, when I don't think there is an answer, when there's probably an answer out there, but I haven't found it yet. And I think that that's what allows me to enter into these new spaces. And it's not always just cutting edge. I take that same mentality and I'll apply it if I'm working with, an alcohol product, or if I'm working on just a general matter that may not even have anything to do with cannabis or regulated substances. But I do think, and I think this is true for, the generation of lawyers who have embarked in these new areas. For me, it's cannabis, but I think that, lawyers who are now working with sort of these name, image, and likeness deals for the NCAA, lawyers who have started working in, the gambling space, I think that way of thinking, in these emerging markets does apply elsewhere, right? And cannabis is still the bread and butter for me. It's what I definitely know the most about, and hemp and all that. But like when Delta 8 came about, when CBD back in 2017, you take that kind of tension with the law, and yeah, it helps understand. And I think what's key here is that ensuring that your clients understand it too, so that you're not just telling them, well, it goes either way. Well, I don't know, but you can actually inform them, here's the uncertainty, and here's what I think you should do, and here's option B. Let's go with one of these options. And I hope that, as things develop, that I'll be able to kind of stay on the cutting edge. And one of the beautiful things now about being, running my firm with Perry is that I can kind of decide where I want to focus and look and see. And, sometimes you look into things. Like I remember when I was a young lawyer, I really thought that if I got, into telehealth and worked on that with medical marijuana, maybe that could be a nice little, practice area. And it just didn't come to pass for me.
You need to be in Australia. You need to be in Australia with telehealth and medical marijuana. They're minting it. I report daily job ads. I think there was a job ad yesterday for a general practitioner, and it was dressed up in a lot of other language, but at the bottom it just said cannabis, and it was $1 million a year.
Well, I guess I was just a little early and in the wrong area.
Yeah, don't worry. It's the way the legislation is formed there. But look, that's an interesting point, because I sort of discovered the same about writing and knowledge, so I started with cannabis because I just thought it'd be more interesting than what I was writing about before, which was legal information and law. And of course, my website sort of just quietly builds each year with new columns. And one thing that sort of interested me that I publish on that I don't really tell anybody about, I'm just collecting information, is just the constant rise of the cocaine industry.
Interesting.
But everybody, and if you follow it every day, I mean, just the numbers of stuff going around the world is quite astounding. I'm really interested if people like yourself think that, existing product, I'm going to call it product, like methamphetamine and cocaine, which is shipped around and used, the demand for these things is huge. If you think there's ever any appetite for regulation of these products, which don't just damage people's health who use them, but I mean, just cause chaos in societies that produce them, whether, I've started writing more and more about this because we've got a knee-jerk reaction with the new administration in Washington, where let's just go in with the US military, or even there was a bill introduced the other day about having private militias that could go to Colombia and wipe out the cartels. They think it's some 80s cocaine movie. And the main issue is we have to think about some sort of regulation and some sort of management of how this, because the demand is never going to go. Do you ever have these discussions with lawyers or professionals of your generation about the stupidity of where we are with these sorts of compounds? You don't have to name, it's not about naming specific compounds, but it's an issue. I mean, everybody uses this stuff. It's as much around as weed, it's as much as around as alcohol. There's TV programs and movies, and it's part of the culture. It's not going away. The only part of it is the regulation part, really, that hasn't been managed. Do you find this is ever a discussion?
I think that early on in 2016 and 2017, that's when I sort of started to see the movement for legalization of all drugs, right? There's some countries have done it. There's been, I think, some, the attempts to get like safe injection sites. And I think that it really is, it's extremely challenging because although I think that, legalizing these substances may be probably is a better approach than what we've done with the war on drugs and, the crazy amount of damage that has been done by the DEA and how, you're much more likely to overdose or get sent to jail for life or get killed by the police because of controlled substances than you were before the DEA, was first implemented in the 1970s. But really, and you touched on this before, I think that if there ever were to be a way to regulate these substances so it wasn't just, these certain substances are illegal and if you get caught, you're going to jail or, whatever it may be, whatever the penalty is, it really does have to focus on the demand because you will never end the supply. I mean, think about it. If you have someone in, whether it's in another country or in this country, who the system has let down, who hasn't had the opportunity for education, who doesn't have, the basic income, right? Who doesn't have healthcare. If you have people in these roles and there's the opportunity to make money, there's always going to be another person stepping up, and that's never going to end. But if you address the situation that those people are in and also that the drug users are in, then maybe you could stop the demand, right? So if there were ever a way to regulate these substances, right, and have it, I don't think that it could ever be necessarily like marijuana, but if there were a way for the government to take funding that is either derived from the sale or is used to try and set up, I guess, these militias and go try and cut off the supply, I think the better bet would be to deal with the demand.
Well,
but the
I mean,
problem with that,
that's what amuses me about politicians, especially those, I mean, all of them, but especially those, on further to the right, is economics is king until it comes to, restricted substances. And then suddenly the normal laws of economics don't apply in their heads. And I never understand, if there is demand, there is going to be supply. And, that's how they run the country. People want to buy cars, they're going to supply cars. People want to ride the bus, they're going to have more buses, etc., etc. So why that doesn't apply to these regulated or illegal substances, it always amazes me that they can't think in the same terms.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I really don't think there's never going to be the ability to completely, get rid of the demand because people from all walks of life use all kinds of drugs, right? Yeah. It's not just an escape from, people who have, people who have, what you'd consider to be a fantastic life. They'll still use cocaine, they'll still use heroin, they'll still use all kinds of substances. So it'll never go away. But I mean, it's a thorny issue though, because I do want to say at the same time, cannabis, I think the cannabis legalization movement is fascinating, but it doesn't always necessarily apply to other substances, right? You can say prohibition never works, but I'll just to use an example of this, right? The psychedelic space